issue? Did they view this as a political issue? Did they view this as a religious issue? There's considerable confusion in our generation of Adventists as to whether to engage or not engage in social and political issues, because there's this concern that it would somehow undermine both our witness and our preaching of the gospel. And that's a valid concern for us. So guys, I'm going to set the stage here for our era by saying that many people don't realize this, but the denomination that we call Seventh-day Adventism really was born during a time of racial turmoil in this country, wasn't it? Adventists choose their name, Seventh-day Adventists, in 1860, and the denomination organizes and incorporates in 1863, right smack in the middle of a civil war over slavery in America. So at a moment in time where the issue of racism, race, and slavery was at the highest peak, that's when the Seventh-day Adventist Church is born, really, in this country. And so that sets us up for some pretty interesting context there. So to understand how early Adventists related to the political and moral issue of slavery before and during the American Civil War, we're going to back up a bit and explore the Millerite origins and highlight who these early Adventists were, what were their affiliations before they became Adventists, and how did they relate to the world around them in their journey to become Adventists. So I want you all to chime in here as we think about the early roots. So tell us about where Adventists came from. We know that there was a movement of abolitionists, a strong anti-slavery movement. We also know that Adventists come from a movement called the Millerites. What does that setting look like? What does that picture look like? And who are some key names we can consider that were part of this early movement? What comes to your minds?
Well, the Millerite movement was launched by William Miller, who started to preach that the world would end in roughly 1843. He starts to preach that in 1831. And that's the same year that a man named William Lloyd Garrison starts publishing a newspaper called The Liberator. And it virtually launches the abolitionist movement, which was a movement that demanded that slavery be abolished immediately and that African Americans be granted equal rights. And so these movements are launched in the same year, and they quickly get intertwined to where they are virtually inseparable. In fact, in my research, I'm very comfortable saying that I don't believe that the Adventist Church would have existed without the abolitionist movement. They were that closely intertwined.
Now pause right there, because that just gets me that raises several questions for me. So the abolitionist movement is a movement that is opposing slavery. At the time, though, slavery is pretty wrapped up in politics. Is that right?
Oh yeah, of course. And religion.
And religion. Oh, yeah. So I think in our conversation, I think this is the part that's so fascinating to me. In our conversation, I want to tease that out more. So we have this close relationship between abolition and the Millerites. And that statement you just made, that without the abolition movement, we wouldn't have our key cast of early Adventists, and the church wouldn't even have formed the way that it did. Can we flesh that out a little more? That's a different way to look at our history.
Yeah, I think so. I'm writing my dissertation on Millerite and Seventh-day Adventist involvement in the abolitionist movement, and I've been tracing William Miller's networks and looking at the key people that join the movement and seeing where they come from, what they're involved in before and during their Millerite activity. And in just about every single case, you see that the people joining the Millerite movement from 1832 onward, so the very next year after this starts, abolitionists are joining. They're joining the ranks. William Miller will publish in 1836. He'll publish very strong statements where he's tying in abolitionist arguments with his doctrine that the advent of Christ is very soon. Specifically, he says that that God is coming soon, and he is going to be judging slaveholders and people who support slavery. And he goes even further than that, borrowing an argument that black abolitionists had made before, that God is going to unleash the 7 last plagues upon the slaveholders in America, just like he had done with the 10 plagues in Egypt that were poured out on slaveholders. And that was never a common argument made by abolitionists. In fact, I haven't been able to trace it to anybody aside from black abolitionists before William Miller makes it himself. But then after the Millerite movement, there are some people in America who start to say the same kinds of things that Miller started to say.
That's I love that. Go ahead, Doug.
Kevin, wouldn't it also be the case if it weren't for Joshua V. Himes, a radical abolitionist and a reformer engaged in all types of reforms? Not many people would have known. At least the people in the larger cities of the nation wouldn't have even known about William Miller.
Yeah, absolutely. So William Miller would have probably died in obscurity if it hadn't been for Joshua Himes. Joshua V. Himes was a Christian connectionist. That's a splinter from a Baptist denomination that had formed around the time of the Revolution. And he was a very active promoter. And so he's the one who publishes the first Millerite paper in 1840. And incidentally, the very same publisher, it was Isaac Knapp, who launched William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, that launches the abolitionist movement. That very same publishing firm is the same firm that publishes the Signs of the Times, the very first Millerite paper. So the same exact organization that launched the abolitionist movement later, in 9 years' time, will launch the Millerite movement. And they will not just simply print the paper, but they will publish. They tell Himes, we will publish the paper, take all the financial risk involved, if you will edit it for free. And Himes agrees to do so. And then eventually will buy out their concern, and they will continue to print the paper, and Himes will be the actual publisher. But they're very, very, very closely connected. And Himes also is able to persuade William Lloyd Garrison to promote both William Miller's lectures in Boston in 1840, as well as the Signs of the Times in his Liberator. So he advertises that. And of course, when you're advertising Millerite paper in an abolitionist paper, you're going to get a certain kind of demographic that's attracted to it, which is, of course, abolitionists. And Garrison is willing to do this for the very fact that he says, basically, this is a rough quote, that he says William Miller is a thorough abolitionist and a temperance advocate as well as non-resistant. So he was a pacifist. And so,
Kevin, I want to stop you right there and just emphasize the coolness of what you're saying there. When we, just the general audience, when we read or even hear about American history, when we hear about slavery in America, like in a secular textbook, right? In a secular textbook or a movie or whatever, and we hear about abolition, anti-slavery, all of these things, I just want to stress that what you're saying implies that the unheard voices behind all of that history, that there are early Adventists that are significant driving forces behind all of that history. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And some of them among the most prominent. Absolutely,
yeah, because
most prominent.
Himes was involved in initiating some anti-slavery societies. So let's jump from there. Kevin, I know you're just jumping at the bits to nerd out some more. What about Joseph Bates? What about Joseph Bates? So for our audience, when Seventh-day Adventists think of the Adventist pioneers, or when Adventists think of the founders of the Adventist church, in popular Adventist knowledge, we think of Ellen White. Ellen White as the founder of Adventism, right? But really, historians have never really believed that, because it's clear that Joseph Bates really should be considered, in many ways, the founder of Seventh-day Adventism before James or Ellen White even came into the picture. Am I right? You guys are looking at me funny. You don't agree with that?
I wouldn't want to deny the role the whites play.
Joseph Bates that introduces the whites to the Sabbath. Joseph Bates is the one that connects the Sabbath to the sanctuary message. So Joseph Bates as a central pioneer, can we talk about his abolition roots? So was Joseph Bates one of the key founders of the Adventist Church? Was he engaged in the social political issues of the time in regard to abolition as well? What was the level of his engagement?
Joseph Bates was very active on the local level. He was a co-founder of the Fairhaven, Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. He was also a co-founder of the, I think it's Bristol County. I can't remember the county that Fairhaven is in, but the county that he lived in, I think it's Bristol County, Massachusetts. He also is a founder of that Anti-Slavery Society. He's a member of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society as well. His wife is also a co-founder of the female Fairhaven Anti-Slavery Society. And he and his wife are very active in the abolitionist movement. They host abolitionists in their home, including prominent leaders like Samuel J. May, who was one of William Lee Garrison's right-hand warriors. They also are very active in their church to the point where they refuse to allow any pro-slavery people to be members of their church. They're also both very active in petitioning. And so Joseph Bates and his wife are not only petitioning to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia, of course, that's the capital of the United States. They're also trying to abolish all sorts of Jim Crow laws in the North. And so what that means is at this time in Massachusetts, it was illegal for a Black person or a mulatto or Native American to marry a white person. And all the train companies also operated what they called Jim Crow cars, in other words, segregated train cars for African Americans. They also had what they called the Paddy car, which was cars for the Irish. They segregated the Irish as well, which, if you know history, Irish, believe it or not, were not considered white at this time. And so anyways, there was all those kinds of things. And Joseph Bates and his wife are among a tiny minority, maybe 1% of the population who are actually petitioning, circulating, and signing these petitions. And in 1843, the train companies agreed to desegregate their cars, and Massachusetts abolished its law of interracial marriage. And so Bates actually, he and his wife actually play a role in overturning two of these most important laws, two of the biggest successes in the abolitionist movement. Now, of course, they were among several hundred, but still a tiny minority of society.
Yeah. So they were on the forefront of that. I want to bring in Dr. Ben because he's holding out his wisdom from us. I want to ask this question on the bigger sense. How did these early Adventists navigate the belief in the second coming of Jesus and things like that with their abolitionist convictions? Why are they so focused on segregation and racism and slavery?
Yeah, that's a very good question. One thing that we need to keep in mind about the Millerite period, which is roughly 1840 to 1845, this is the main Millerite period, is that slavery, which 2.5 million Blacks at that time, around 2.5 million Blacks, were enslaved in the United States at that time. And of course, we know that there was slavery of all types, but perhaps the slavery that most readily comes to our mind is plantation slavery. Okay, so 2.5 million Blacks were enslaved. And what we need to realize here as Seventh-day Adventists and as Christians is that slavery at that time was not a decided issue that everyone was against. It was extremely controversial. And this is us as Adventists who are not simply echoing what the society says.
So you're trying to say early Adventists were radical. You're trying to say early Adventists were radical.
Oh, indeed. And in fact, if you study the history of slavery, many Protestant churches separated, broke off, split because of the issue of slavery. And in fact, our first notions of what was Babylon from Revelation 14:8. Babylon has fallen. And Revelation 18:2, come out of her, my people. One of the first indicators of the identity of Babylon was that the churches went along with slavery. Okay, so now we as Adventists, we may claim, a marker of Babylon is that they reject the three angels' messages, or they don't keep the seventh-day Sabbath, or what have you. But one of the initial signs was that the church supported slavery. Okay, obviously the biggest indication that everyone was not on the same page with slavery was because there was a civil war in which 700,000 people died in the war. Mm-hmm. And so this is what Adventists should take away from this period. And that is that we were not always, because we've often been accused of echoing society, not coming out with our own stands, just echoing what the moral mores are. But in this case, many of the Adventists who were a part of these Protestant denominations, the Christian Church, Methodists, Baptists, what have you, they were going against what some of their fellow church members believed. So they were going out on a limb. Let me say this to answer your question, Jeffrey, in terms of slavery and the second coming.
I'm loving what you're saying already.
Yeah, it's a tough question, because in many of the pioneers' minds, thinking, slavery was interwoven with the second coming. Okay, before they joined the Millerite movement, and of course during the Millerite years, many of our pioneers were actively trying, I'm saying politically engaged. Any way you cut it, politically engaged. As Kevin mentioned, signing petitions, speaking to politicians, voting against slavery. They were totally politically engaged, disputing, fighting against the racism of their day. Hello. The racism of their day, they were politically engaged in that. Many of them had such a hard time with overthrowing slavery. They didn't see the annulment, the abrogation of slavery happening fast enough, that they believed that only the second coming of Jesus could get rid of slavery. Many of them actually held that. You can see it in Miller's writing. Miller said only Jesus' second coming will free the slaves. That doesn't mean that they stopped. That doesn't mean that they stopped their anti-slavery activity, their abolitionist activity. But they said this is so heinous, probably like some of us now. We say racism in America is so heinous, it's so evil, that this will only be totally eradicated when Jesus comes. So they said their concept of America, in fact, for the prophecy buffs in here, if you look at Revelation 13, 11 through 18, there's a lamb-like beast, and they identified the lamb-like beast of prophecy as the United States of America, partly because of America's treatment of Black people.
Yeah, and we're gonna get to that. We're gonna get to that. We need to park there, because we need to park there for a minute and spend some time on that, because that is huge. Before we get there, though, because Ben just took us for that ride. Before we get there, there are other characters, there are other protagonists in this early Adventist movement. For example, people like John Byington. And again, when the typical Seventh-day Adventist today thinks about the Adventist church and the early pioneers, nobody thinks, oh yeah, John Byington. That's on the tip of nobody's tongue, right? Yet John Byington was the first General Conference president of the Adventist Church. And I don't know about you, but I've been reading the biography and just completely blown away to discover that John Bionton was not only a zealous abolitionist and signed petitions to Congress, but he he was involved in the Underground Railroad. He built churches that contained secret hiding places for fugitive slaves to hide in on the Underground Railroad on the way up to Canada. So all of these things are coming together to just show a very, very interesting picture and culture of early Adventism. There's this concept of engagement with the issues of their day, and that they weren't just huddled in church preaching to each other, right, sermonizing, but that there was a real engagement with the society around them. Now, you just hinted at something I'd like to transition to now, Ben, and that was that early Seventh-day Adventists became really radical and unique with this idea that the United States of America was somehow relevant in the book of Revelation, right? That there's these symbols, these poetic symbols in the book of Revelation that describe different powers throughout history, rather, and that American history plays into that. And so can we park there for a second and talk about how the issue of racism and slavery around them informed their reading of the Bible? For example, we can just establish that throughout the 1850s and 1860s, Adventists were dealing with the most heinous national transgression, right? The evil of slavery, and they labeled that system as one of the most I'm quoting here. This is from Review and Herald in 1862, that slavery was one of the most diabolical systems that has ever cursed the earth, right? So let's hone in a bit here. So we have these Adventists. They're in the 1850s now, right? And they're paying attention to what's happening in DC. They're reading the newspaper. They're watching the news, so to speak, reading the newspaper. And they're noticing the different policies that are being voted, they're being legislated. Let's hone in there a bit and see how do Bible-believing Christians in the 1850s, who are emphasizing the second coming of Jesus, how are they reading legislation in their own nation, and how is that coloring the way they view their nation in respect to their theology? So I'm thinking of, for example, let me open this up and you guys run with it. In 1850, there's this game changer legislation called the Fugitive Slave Law, or the Fugitive Slave Act. Can we talk about that for a minute and discuss how this plays into early Adventist formation? Because I'm certain that most of us are not aware that these things played into how Adventists became a church. What was the Fugitive Slave Act, and how did Adventists respond to that?
Well, one thing it's important to realize is that this Fugitive Slave Act touched the lives of every person in the North, because you're now required by federal law to cooperate with the apprehension of alleged fugitives. Many other details we could go into, but I think this is something that brought the issue home. And Ellen White's position, of course, was that we should not obey.
And Doug, maybe we should spell it out real quick. In 1850, there's a law that's voted into legislated that demands that runaway slaves be returned to their slave masters, and that anybody who does not comply in aiding the return of those slaves to their slave masters is violating American law. Yeah?
Yeah.
So that rings through the news.
It's a radical ramping up. The laws had been there, but they had been blocked by various means in the northern states. And so as part of a compromise, the nation's already on the brink of falling apart, going to war. One thing that was given to the South was to say, all right, we're going to try to stop this runaway slavery situation and have a law with teeth in it. But it really, it meant that slavery was no longer just sort of and an armchair issue for some political devotees to debate. But now it's a question of what will you do?
I think that if I can speak, that Ellen White, when she advocated civil disobedience, let's say disobedience to a government law proposition, which we as Adventists are very familiar with in the context of the mark of the beast. We believe that one day we will have to disobey the government. But what we don't realize is that our founders did that over issues regarding race. We know that not all laws are just laws. I mean, from American history, we know that some laws merit disobedience. And Ellen White said it's about your connection with God, the God of justice. And when you see a law that you know is unjust, you must disobey it. And I think that we've lost, some of the comments are talking about how our church became Laodicea. I think Ellen White, one of you can correct me, but I think Ellen White first identified the church as Laodicea around 1849, 50, somewhere like that.
Which would have been during this period.
Yeah.
And she got it from William Miller before her.
Yes, because initially Adventists were relatively poor. We didn't have any political power, very little political power. So when Ellen White was making this statement, it wasn't doing us any favors. And that's why, throughout our history, when we've been trying to curry political favor, it's been a mistake, because when we were most adamant, when we were most activists on racial issues, which is the message of Jesus, which is love and justice, when we were the most adamant, it was when we were poor, when we weren't increased with goods, when we didn't have any political position or government emoluments. That's when we were the most activist. When you study Adventist history, it's interesting because Adventism grew up with Black people in America, as it were. We began during the Civil War. Some people say that the Adventist church really began not only because of property disputes and money issues, but because of the draft crisis with the Civil War. And so if we were indeed partly started by issues over Black people, it's very interesting. Maybe we as a church should speak up more on these racial issues.
Oh, man.
We grew up during Reconstruction, sort of like with Black America. And that was when, and this is another major theme with our church and race, and that is that many times we have had to address race, because only when we address race can we do evangelism. So imagine, and you know that our evangelism is our raison d'etre, it's our sine qua non, it's our reason for existence. So imagine being a Millerite. The Millerites were persona non grata in the American South because they were anti-slavery, and because they were persona non grata, they couldn't evangelize in the American South. So later, Adventists came up with the doctrine that we must evangelize the entire world with the three angels' messages. They really didn't have that sensibility back in the Millerite period. But once they realized we must evangelize the entire world, that means something has to happen to slavery. Because slavery not only stopped us from going down south, but it was an interposition of religious liberty. Slaves could not keep the Sabbath. Slaves could not really become Adventists. They had no religious liberty. So we had to address these racial issues in order to conduct our evangelism. This continued during the Reconstruction period, during Jim and Jane Crow. We see the Southern Missionary Society, Ellen White's son, down south, and they really couldn't do evangelism well because of, the Jim Crow laws. And so these racial, we have several motivations for speaking out as Adventists against racism. One of them is because it makes our evangelism possible.
Dude, you're just gonna pause like that? You're just gonna leave it like that?
I have to stop.
You got me on the edge of my seat, bro. Wow. I mean, there's so much there. I don't even know what to do with that, Mio. So you said, so the Adventist movement takes shape as it takes shape in relation to the African American plight, right? It takes shape in relation to that community. And the situation of that community in many ways informs the sensibilities of early Adventists, which in turn helps them fine tune and articulate their doctrine. So this is important, I think, because it just shows, yes, there's theological and expository and Bible study going on with all of these doctrines in the church. But there's an element here about there are human beings in the United States that are being treated as less than human.
Yeah, let me
and for people paying
point.
attention, that matters. Go ahead,
let me illustrate in another way what Ben is talking about. So going back to the Fugitive Slave Law, okay? Let me help you walk through the history of the passage of this law and the development of the Adventist response, which was a theological and political response to the Fugitive Slave Law. So
underline that, yes.
January 1850, there is a Virginia senator named James M. Mason who submits this law to the Senate. Okay, early February, another senator from Kentucky named Henry Clay, he says, let's add these compromise measures, which Doug Morgan mentioned to you before. And then over the next 9 months, everyone in America is debating this law. It's a huge commotion, and all this stuff is happening. In the late summer, there are numerous anti-fugitive slave law meetings held in various places in the North. One of those is held, one of the most famous, in fact, because Frederick Douglass is there, a really famous abolitionist who was also a Millerite and a Seventh-day Sabbath keeper. His name's Garrett Smith. He was also there. And this is taking place in a town called Cazenovia in Madison County, New York. Okay, and that happened on August 2, 1850. And it's a major anti-fugitive slave law meeting that was advertised in Garrison's Liberator and all this kind of stuff. Within days of that meeting, a Seventh-day Adventist named Samuel W. Rhodes, one of our most prominent ministers of the earliest years, and a resident of Madison County, New York, who lived in that same county with Garrett Smith, the same county where that major fugitive slave law convention was held, within days, he makes a chart, a prophecy chart, that includes reference to a new beast that Millerites had virtually ignored, the two-horned beast of Revelation 13. Then, within about a week, Samuel Rhodes is in Michigan, and he starts to preach that the two-horned beast of Revelation 13 was, quote-unquote, the Protestant churches and republicanism. So he ties it with the United States of America. Then the Senate is going to pass the Fugitive Slave Law bill on August 23, just a couple of days after that. Then on September 12, the House will ratify the Fugitive Slave Law bill. 3 days after that, another Adventist minister, Hiram S. Case, writes a letter to the Adventist paper that James White edited called The Present Truth. And he starts talking about Revelation 13 and the two-horned beast. And he says that he is now convinced that this represents the Protestant churches and republicanism united. So in other words, the United States of America. Then 3 days after he writes that letter, the President of the United States ratifies and signs the Fugitive Slave Law into act. After that, about a month later to the day almost, on October 23, 1850, Ellen White had a vision at the home of Otis Nichols. And at his house, she sees a vision of the two-horned beast. She sees that this is present truth and the Adventists should be promoting this. And she sees that we need to publish that chart that Samuel Rhodes had originally made. And so she convinces Otis Nichols to do so. And so Otis Nichols borrows Samuel Rhodes' chart and he actually publishes it, and then they start to sell it. And then every single Seventh-day Adventist minister takes that chart around, and everywhere they're preaching, they're holding this up and they're saying, look at this. America is the two-horned beast of Revelation because it's uniting republicanism and Protestantism, and it's claiming that we grant religious liberty. It's claiming that we grant civil and social liberty, and yet in reality, it is denying those liberties because on the one hand, you've got people that have no religious freedom, but more importantly, you have all these millions of slaves that are enslaved in the South, and people denied of their rights even in the North. And so that becomes hugely important for Adventists. All right, go ahead, Doug. You were going to add something.
Well, I'm just going to ask Kevin, are you saying that they were saying that this prophecy of Revelation 13 was in the process of being fulfilled right then?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. All right. I just
Absolutely.
wanted to be sure.
Yeah,
and you argue that in your book, Adventism in the American Republic. That
absolutely.
We have got to
Go ahead.
plug Doug's book, Kevin. Adventism in the American Republic. That book was a game changer for me in my undergraduate studies. I read that and I was like, I need to go back to school.
My favorite book on Adventist history ever.
Yeah. So Kevin, that's amazing. You just drew a line. You just drew a line from the recognition, the awareness, the conscious response to the plight of the African American community in this nation. You drew a line from that to the conclusion that this nation is undeniably the power represented in the book of Revelation that claims to be lamb-like, but really speaks like a dragon.
Yeah, and
it withholds freedom from human beings.
Absolutely. And the argument that Doug makes in his book is absolutely correct. And he basically says this: if you ever hear someone preaching the two-horned beast, what we now call the lamb-like beast of Revelation 13, if you ever hear an Adventist minister preaching that, they will say that eventually America will become this beast of Revelation.
Oh, I hear you going.
They're going to point to the National Sunday Law.
Yeah.
Okay. But get this. Doug's totally right here. Whenever we start advocating this doctrine, we don't say this is a future reality. We say right now, the American nation, America, the United States of America, is the two-horned beast of Revelation, not just because we're worried about a national Sunday law, but also, and even more importantly at this time, because Black people are enslaved by the millions in the South, and there are people in the North who are denied their rights as well. And they also throw in Native Americans there too and say that they are denied their rights. And so for those reasons, America is the beast at present and will continue to grow and become worse. But even so, right now, it is that beast because of social injustice and also religious liberty injustices.
So powerful. Thank you, Kevin. So powerful. Hey, at the time, several books were written breaking down and articulating this doctrine of Adventism's view of America in prophecy. I want to read very quickly here from J.N. Loughborough, which was one of the several early Adventists that wrote books on this topic. And I just want to read one of the opening lines in the introduction because it's like good. Let me read this real quick. He says this is on a book about this subject. He says, quote, "Are you a politician? Noting the oppressive acts of this government upon the colored portion of our race? Well, here's a description of your vast republic, a description not only of its past acts, but of still greater oppression which lies in the future. We may expect that as the oppressive rulers of our nation," right? Lump them all together. "The oppressive rulers of our nation manifest no disposition to reform, that their fostered spirit of oppression will increase till even white men will suffer from their oppression." That's like the intro. That's like the introduction. Oh, once we're done with that, okay, now let's get into Revelation 13. It's like, we lost something, man. We lost the plot. That blade is dull, something. But the way that the church interacts with its own heritage and the development of what it says to the world, that's been lost. Let me shut up now. Go ahead, Ben.
No, sorry. Please finish.
You mentioned earlier, Ben, this concept that you mentioned 2.5 something million people back in the 1840s were slaves. Yeah. Loughborough, after he says that, moves into this. And I want to stress this because one of the things that I'm personally shocked about as I read Adventist history is how radical their dissent was about their own nation.
Yeah.
It wasn't a America rah rah rah, America bless the world, God's gift to the world. Listen to what he says here. He even mocks the Declaration of Independence in that introduction. He says the Declaration of Independence should have really said all men are created free and equal, except 3.5 million slaves. And then he goes on from there, just blasting his guns.
Well, so, you know, Jeffrey, this was the time, and your audience will forgive my language, but this was the time in which Adventists were the niggers of Christendom.
Mm-hmm.
Uh-oh. I'm the only black guy, so I could say the N-word. But when
break that down. What do you mean by that?
Well, when you look at Adventists, they were not accepted as true Christians. They were marginalized. They didn't have any political power. They were often discriminated against for who they were, but let's say by going to church on the Sabbath or from their strange beliefs, what have you. There was a lot that lined up to them as what the nation then thought of black people as, you know, the N-word. It wasn't until recently, you know, I mean, we know some of the history. It wasn't until recently in which we curried favor with the so-called evangelicals. And we became in. We became popular. But for so long, Adventists were looked at as a cult. We weren't true Christians. And we were just lambasted by popular Protestant. By popular Protestantism, we weren't considered Christians. Interestingly, it was then when we had our biggest voice in terms of calling out injustice.
Awesome point.
Calling out America, calling out others. It was then when we weren't accepted. But you see the kind of thing that acceptance does. You know what Jesus says, woe is you when all men speak well of you and all this stuff. I also want to point out that because many in the comment section are asking, you know, what can we do to be active? And many, especially in this high charged atmosphere, they think that activism is, let's say, signing a petition or going downtown and protesting, and or having a service on something in church, doing a social media post. It is all that, but bear in mind, even in the early period, all of the different activism that Adventists were engaged in, okay? Not only were they speaking out against injustice in print, and as we've shown, they were not speaking out against injustice on something everybody agreed with. And so George Floyd was killed, Ahmaud Arbery was killed, Breonna Taylor was killed, and so suddenly the church issues all these statements because, my goodness, everyone else is doing it. Adventists were beyond this. They were
ahead of that. They were ahead of that.
They were speaking against this when there was a political price to this. And it was prophetic. It wasn't just parroting what the society was saying. And so Adventists, they engaged in social justice by speaking out against injustice. They provided relief and shelter. They had orphanages. They had health care to the unfortunate. It's like John Harvey Kellogg. He's lambasted now because doctrinally he went off. But my goodness, he was always in the hood. He was always in the ghetto. He was always in the slums trying to make things better for people. He had a heart for mission and for social justice. So while we can criticize him doctrinally for the Living Temple and really a whole list of things, he got crazy in everything. Kevin can even tell you he got involved in the Eugenics movement. He got crazy in everything. He was, but he had a heart for mission. So when you look at the Chicago Mission and others, when you look at the Southern Missionary Society and others, even some other apostates like Canwright and others, they were educating Black people. Okay, and education was a form of social justice activism. And so throughout our whole history, you see Adventists engaging in social justice activism in the simple ways that they could. Now, Jeffrey, when Blacks came into Adventism, which there were really no appreciable amount of Blacks until, I don't know, 1880s, 1890s, what have you. When blacks came into Adventism, they didn't have the luxury of not being involved in their communities.
Right, right.
Okay? I mean,
They
blacks
were that community,
involved in their communities because it's like they were right there in their community. So you've always seen blacks have medical mobile units. You've always seen them giving out food to the poor in their churches. I mean, they were always involved in that because blacks haven't always seen the distinction between, Jeffrey, I feel that the distinction between politics and everything else is something of privilege. Okay? It's for people who have privilege. All right?
Because if it's not affecting you personally, you can ditch it off as, oh, that's political. Let's stick to evangelism and to theology.
Yeah. Whereas the message of the Millerites and early Adventists is that we're nowhere near the South. We are a world removed from the South, but we are still going to do what's in our power to end slavery, even though it's not a reality in Maine or Connecticut or Michigan. This is not really a reality to us, but we're still going to speak against it. And so Adventists, they spoke truth to power despite these issues not being right near them. Early Adventists.
This speaks to there's a certain degree of empathy there, huh? Of just connecting. Go ahead, Doug.
I think there's another aspect of what Ben was saying that's so very important, that one of the most important ways that we can be political in the best sense of the word is not by trying to ally with a particular political party and trying to seize the levers of power and be in charge of the culture and so forth, but by being the alternative community and by setting up those institutions for education and healthcare that have a powerful ripple effect. Yes, we speak out against injustice, we vote, but our politics is not about seizing power, top down, coercive power.
Beautifully put. We should say a word. Let's move it along here. We're running out of time quickly. That it's just stuff that happens when you're having too much fun and nerding out on all this history. Let's move it along, and we've been talking about the Fugitive Slave Law. And how did Ellen White respond to the Fugitive Slave Law? You alluded to it earlier, Doug. You mentioned something about Ellen White's comments about that.
Yeah, and Kevin mentioned it too. I think one angle that I would add is that the rationale is that another human being can't own another human being. This is God's property. And so we can't go along with it, and we have to accept the penalty. If we're prosecuted, we have to be willing to accept that, but we cannot cooperate with this manifest evil.
So Adventists believed that God had his own fugitive slave law. And permit me, if you will, to read a passage from Scripture. Deuteronomy 23, verses 15 and 16, a passage that most people probably are not familiar with, but it says this in the New King James: "You shall not give back to his master the slave who has escaped from his master to you. He may dwell with you in your midst, in the place which he chooses within your gates, where it seems best to him. You shall not oppress him." And so Seventh-day Adventists across the board, not just Ellen White. Ellen White has a vision and says that God is basically telling you to disobey the Fugitive Slave Law, which is awesome. But Adventists, even before that, were saying we shouldn't obey this thing. And there were several that operated stops on the Underground Railroad. And so they would say many things. And whenever a fugitive slave was captured, sometimes they spoke out. And so one Adventist layperson named Edwin R. Seaman, in 1854, there was a fugitive slave named Anthony Burns, and he was recaptured in Boston. And Boston is prided itself up to this point as being like the center of the abolitionist movement. No one ever returned to slavery from Boston. They had mobs and so forth, and they had prevented others from being returned on a few other occasions. But the United States government was so adamant that they brought out the federal troops, cannons, guns, all sorts of things, hundreds of soldiers to make sure that this one slave, Anthony Burns, would go back to slavery in the They would not do that. And so Edwin R. Seaman, a Seventh-day Adventist, writes out in opposition to this. And this is what he says. It's really, really amazing thing. He says, a man made in God's image is torn from his friends and society and all that is dear in life and dragged back into slavery by the power of that atrocious bargain, the Fugitive Slave Law, the foulest stain that ever blotted the history of any nation, especially one whose professions are entirely of an opposite character. And while the unfeeling slave catchers are acting upon the authority of this law, the military are called out to support them with loaded guns and cannon. Efforts were made to purchase the slave's freedom, but it was not to be bought. The mouthpiece of the two-horned beast, the president, must show his power and dragon authority. Hear him speak to the U.S. Marshal, quote, your course is approved, enforce the law at any expense, end quote. And then he quotes that passage from Deuteronomy 23 that I just read to you. And then he says this is God's fugitive slave law today. Thus, we see the character of the beast developed, which has affirmed that all men are created free and equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If this nation would not be the most hypocritical nation on the face of the earth, it should amend this declaration thus: all white men, and he emphasizes the word white, all white men are created free and equal, etc. Has not this two-horned, lamb-like beast corrupted the commandment as well as the Roman dragon? That is just one example of many, many voices.
And I'm glad you mentioned Deuteronomy 23, because I was not aware of what you just quoted. I've run into Deuteronomy 23, for example, in Loughborough and some of the other Adventists. And when they're writing about legislation, about the Fugitive Slave Law, they're quoting, like you say, Deuteronomy 23. And they're basically saying, this is a religious issue. This is not a political issue merely. It becomes a religious issue. And I will stress that before we land this plane. But I think that is so critical to always revisit the fact that we're not talking about a group of Adventist pioneers that are fixated on politics per se. They're fixated on their theology about God. And their theology about God is coloring how they are arriving at their political positions. I think that is very critical. And should I say, not the other way around, right? Not the other way around.
It was actually
loud enough.
True. It was actually very, very simple for Adventists. You must have your loyalty to God, not loyalty to man. And so whenever man passes a law that goes against God's laws, you're duty bound to follow God rather than man, which is why they are willing to break a federal law, because God said they should have their freedom.
Amen.
And so it was all about loyalty to God versus loyalty to man, which is also why, as Doug's sort of alluding, they avoided partisan politics.
Yeah. We should point out.
Yeah, go ahead.
We should point out, Kevin, real quick here, that when they're quoting scripture, they're also lambasting Christian America, because Christian America is also quoting scripture.
Yep.
They're quoting scripture to support the violation of human rights and human dignity. And so there's this debate that goes on as well in the literature that I've been running into over and over again, of Adventists just going after Christian America. And they actually say repeatedly, this is not a Christian nation. This is not a Christian nation. And maybe that's more, I'm in the 1880s and 1890s. That's where I hang out, with my boy A.T. Jones and Wagner. And it's just like, it's loud and clear. This is not a Christian nation, right? So think about that for a second. I mean, think about the disconnect between that generation and our generation, where there is a sense of legitimate patriotism, let's be clear. But there's this warped patriotism that we see in the Christian establishment in this nation. And it would be great to be able to say, that has not affected the Seventh-day Adventist community. But that would be a straight up lie, right? We know that. That would be a lie. So I think part of this history, this is not just nerding out on history. This is really, this should be challenging to us all, because it challenges the very core of our worldview, a worldview we thought we were basing on the early writings. So look, it's time to, I'm gonna cut this in half. we got through about half of the stuff I was interested in throwing at y'all. So let's land with a man named John Brown. Let's land with a man named John Brown, and we'll park right there for now. So the Civil War has not taken place yet. We're still in the late 1850s, and there's this radical debate, this hard debate, this intense debate taking place between pro-slavery and anti-slavery, right? And many many abolitionists are obviously white, as Kevin has pointed out. And one of these abolitionists' name is John Brown. Now, John Brown, I want to emphasize again, is all over our history books. If you studied the Civil War in school, in high school even, you would have run into the name John Brown. So I want to emphasize that just to show that everything you read in secular history, behind the scenes, there are some fascinating, there's a strong presence of the Adventist community. So John Brown decides, and I'm just gonna butcher the history a bit, and you guys just jump in and let's flesh this out. John Brown decides that slavery must end, and it can't end friendly, patting each other on the back or asking nicely. It has to end with some force, right? So he gathers a little group together, and they decide that they're going to inspire slave rebellion, right? In order to overturn the slave masters. So he conducts a raid on a federal arsenal, Harper's Ferry, all right? And it's the year's 1859. This event is considered by many historians as one of the major catalysts for sealing the Civil War. The Civil War is happening. He was captured. They were not successful. He was hanged, and the slaves that he gathered were all killed. Right. This explodes throughout the news, throughout the nation. And Adventists were picking up the newspapers and they were reading as well. I leave it to you there. How did the Adventists respond? Were there any connections? Were there any secondary, tertiary connections to this event? And how were the early Adventist leaders responding to this?
Well, let me throw in one thing, and I think Ben and Kevin are both going to have much more powerful things to say on this. But, what happened with Brown is what he did was strategically it made no sense. Frederick Douglass said, I'm not going to go along with that. It's crazy. But when Brown was put on trial, and I should back up and say most of the moderate, respectable Northern press denounced him. But when he was put on trial and he was given an opportunity to speak, he was so powerful and so eloquent in nailing the injustices that had accumulated in the nation and giving this diagnosis that it's almost seems that's what was supposed to happen. I just leave it at that.
Beautiful.
Let me back up too before the raid. So an important factor that made his raid possible, even though it was unsuccessful, was a group of 6 men that historians have called the Secret Six. And these are men who knew about John Brown's raid, and at least some of the details, the exact amount of details is difficult to determine by historians, but they at least knew about the general outlines. And one of these men was Garrett Smith. And I mentioned him a little earlier. Garrett Smith had been a Millerite. He went through the Great Disappointment. And in fact, On October 21, 1844, he writes a letter to his wife and says, "We've had worship probably for the last time." And so he actually believed that Christ was coming back on October 22, 1844.
Proper Millerite.
A short time after that, he adopts the Seventh-day Sabbath. And Seventh-day Adventists interacted with him quite a bit. So some other connections that are super important. One of his next-door neighbors and very close friends was James Caleb Jackson. And if you know anything about Adventist history, it's James Caleb Jackson who operated our home on the hillside in Dansville, New York, and James and Ellen White go there to learn about health reform. And they stayed there on 2 occasions. They knew him personally. Also, Garrett Smith's daughter, Elizabeth, is the one who designs and the first woman to wear a dress called the American costume. And that is that dress that Ellen White sees and says, that's great, but it's not exactly what God wants in mind. And so she creates her own reform dress in contrast to that very dress that Garrett Smith's daughter made. And I can also add a Seventh-day Adventist minister, a black former slave, John West, lived 300 feet from his mansion in Peterborough, New York, and was
from Garrett Smith's mansion.
From Garrett Smith's mansion, and so he is preaching on Sabbaths there in Peterborough. And let me also go back. I mentioned Samuel W. Rhodes. He's the one who comes up with this two-horned beast argument. He's the one who creates the first chart. He knew Garrett Smith personally and had eaten at his table in his home. And so there are connections here. We don't know how deep and how far they go, but Seventh-day Adventists knew this man. Joseph Bates in 1850, I think it was, goes to Peterborough and preaches on the sanctuary doctrine and the Sabbath. Garrett Smith is in attendance.
Wow.
And even though Garrett Smith doesn't accept the quote-unquote sanctuary doctrine, he is a Seventh-day Sabbath keeper, and they have great conversations. And, of course, they commiserate, and they have a lot to share when it comes to abolition as well. And so there are strong connections here. And so Garrett Smith, he is one of the members of the Secret Six. And this is fraught with irony and in so many ways, because Garrett Smith eventually is supportive of violence to eradicate slavery. And so he finances not just John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, but he had also financed before, a few years earlier, his activity in Kansas, which led to what's called Bleeding Kansas, where pro-slavery Southerners are fighting against Yankees and New Yorkers in Kansas, whether or not to decide whether or not Kansas will adopt a slavery constitution. And so Garrett Smith is eventually doing this. But get this, when he is funding John Brown, he is concurrently the vice president of the American Peace Society. He's a pacifist. He is continuing to uphold, to the best of his ability, a belief in pacifism, while also trying to reconcile to it's gut-wrenching to try to deal with this problem, this horrible issue of slavery, where people are being abused in every kind of way in the South as well as in the North. And so he's torn. And so eventually, even as a vice president of the American Peace Society, he funds John Brown's raid. And then whenever the news comes out that he has been involved, he will be so fraught over this that he actually will deny it publicly. And he will destroy all of his personal correspondence and letters and diaries to try to show that he was involved. He destroys all of that. And the issue actually made him lose his sanity. And he ends up in the Utica Insane Asylum for a few months. And so this shows how deeply troubling it was to him. But John Brown, I don't know how many connections he has with Millerites, but his brother-in-law was also a Millerite. They had some issues back and forth. They didn't get along a whole lot, but I don't know that it had anything to do with Millerism. Now, nevertheless, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, let's bring it home with the fascinating story of.
Oh, okay, I want to turn it to Ben now. Ben, tell us about Ellen White's response to
Tell us about that
Brown.
train ride, and then we need to land this plane on that train ride.
Yes, this was shortly after John Brown's raid, and the newspapers were full of reports of it. And Loughborough was traveling with Ellen White in 1859, and this is what Loughborough writes about the occasion. And of course, we know that Loughborough was, for all intents and purposes, the first Adventist historian. Although he was a lay Adventist historian, he wrote what we consider to be the first proper book of Adventist history, The Rise. Help me out, guys.
The Rise and Progress of the Second Advent Movement.
Progress, which later became Great Second Advent Movement.
Right.
Yes.
And so he says, as we read of John Brown's failure, we became somewhat mirthful over what seemed to us like a foolhardy enterprise. Had we known that we afterward learned why his scheme failed, we would have felt different. We learned that hundreds had promised to join him that day at Harper's Ferry, not for plunder, but with the one object of liberating the slaves. The people did not come like Gideon's 22,000, fearful and faint-hearted. They stand at home. And forgive this, the English is really bad because this is just Loughborough writing down his reminiscences. Sister White at once checked our smiles over Brown's case. She said, quote, Brown's motives in that movement were all right. His sympathies were aroused for the cruel treatment of the slaves. That led him to make the move he did to secure for them what our Declaration of Independence says all men are entitled to: liberty. Let me read that again. This is Ellen White. This is John Loughborough reporting what Ellen White says. She says, John Brown's sympathies were aroused for the cruel treatment of the slaves that led him to make the move he did to secure for them what our Declaration of Independence says all men are entitled to: liberty. Brown's raid was not for plunder nor murder. Then she gave us to understand that there would be a move on a greater scale than Brown's that would liberate the slaves. Surely that prediction has been fulfilled. And of course, we know that one of Ellen White's key early predictions, I wouldn't say early predictions, but she predicted the Civil War and the great loss, but even more than that prediction, the great loss that would occur with the Civil War, with some 700,000. Interestingly, and this bears on Kevin's research, interestingly, she said, was this at Roosevelt, New York, Kevin? Where she had the vision about the Civil War?
Parkville,
okay.
Michigan.
Parkville, Michigan. She said that some here will lose their children, the men in their family, to the war. And Kevin has recently done research. Oh boy, here we go. That bears out that there were a plethora, almost I think 10% of the men who were of age, of Adventists who fought on the side of the Union in the Civil War to free the enslaved people, enslaved blacks. And so this is an amazing bombshell. Before Kevin's research, we didn't know that Adventists were involved as much as they were in the Civil War. So, Jeffrey, this is activism, social justice activism on an entirely different level. Greater love hath no man than this, that he laid down his life.
Beautiful. And to go back to the Brown episode, Ben, you've outlined beautifully there. I mean, there's this effort, right? This desperate effort to do something about this horrible situation, and the politicians are not doing it. And he takes matters into his own hands, and the situation becomes violent, and there's destruction of property and more violence. And these guys are on the train with Ellen White, and they're laughing. Oh man, this guy's crazy. Look, what is he doing? This is crazy. And Ellen White says, stop laughing. Stop making fun of him, because in essence, in my own words, she's saying, what's the big picture here? Look at the bigger picture. And somebody in the comments said, wait, is Ellen White condoning murder? Because John Brown and them were that's a beautiful question in the comments, because that's exactly, I think, the point we're making here. The point is, no, she did not condone murder. The point is, while not condoning murder, she was able to back up and to look at the bigger picture of what people in the heart of hearts were trying to do. So you can withhold your endorsement of the violence that took place at the John Brown raid at Harper's Ferry, while at the same time legitimize the heart of the cause and what people are crying out to do. And the obvious implications of that, right? I mean, we've been bombarded with news that our great cities. I mean, I was in LA for months, and now I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, and craziness happening on the streets, and there's rioting, and there's violence and the destruction of property, and it's very easy to just cling to that and to lose the bigger picture, of what's happening in our society, rather than sitting back and piously criticizing. Ellen White said, stop criticizing John Brown's raid. Yes, craziness went on, and we don't need to endorse that. But you are missing the point if you're not getting the bigger picture of what's happening here. What he was trying to do was redress the violation of human dignity. And we need to jump on board with that. And I think that that's just very powerful.
Jeffrey, real quick, just one more word. When you look at slavery and what was happening in slavery, lives were already being lost. You get me?
Yes.
Lives were already being lost. So, I mean, today, not to draw too close a parallel for our, those listening, but people are already dying. Okay, people are already dying. So that's the thing with John Brown's raid. It's trying to overthrow a system that is already killing people. So when you ask the question, does Ellen White condone violence, or was she condoning John Brown's murder, which in effect we now know, scholars now know that John Brown was in a military mindset. And so, we could have a whole nother discussion about military ethics. Okay, and as to if something's really murder if you do it in the context of war. But we won't go there. We will not go there with an Adventist audience. Okay, but people were already dying in slavery.
Yeah, and we need and there's this.
When you say, was she condoning murder, it's like he was trying to overthrow a system in which more people would die in a couple of days than So I mean, it's kind of a moral quagmire when you try to go there. Anyway.
And what we said earlier is really easy. Like, I'm sitting here, I'm in Palo Alto, California, man. This is like paradise, right? I'm hearing the birds chirping. I'm seeing the little squirrels. Literally right now, watching squirrels climbing trees. This is a beautiful, quintessential American dream neighborhood, right? It's very easy to sit on this couch right now, on this chair, and cast judgment on people who are living in an absolute crisis of a situation, crisis of existence, and not sympathize with the messiness of what it means to live in this world with corrupt powers and corrupt policies. And so anyways, we need to wrap up here. We're running out of time. As much as I could talk to you guys all day long, all night long, but we can land there. We've charted a trajectory from the 1840s, from the Millerite Movement, up until 1859. This is the total tease, because the Civil War doesn't start till what? Probably exactly a year later or so.
1861, April.
Yeah. So we're just before the Civil War, and we're going to pause it right there because, frankly, we've run out of time. But in pausing there, we could just cut back to just some closing summaries and closing remarks that basically that capture the heart of what this conversation has brought out throughout the history. And that is that Adventists, early Adventists, that early generation of Adventists were indeed engaged, as Doug Morgan puts it, with the central political issue of the time. But their engagement, we need to underscore, put this in all caps, was not in order to align or to serve a specific political party, or even to gain points as Ben alluded to earlier, with the in crowd or with a prevailing social norm. But it was on their own terms, on the terms that was consistent with the Adventist worldview. But what I think is fascinating is those terms would actually put them on the forefront of what's happening. Like Ben said, everyone's issuing statements, right? Issuing statements of solidarity with Floyd and these other atrocities that have taken place. And yet it feels like everyone's just jumping on the wagon of what's acceptable. This sort of radical Adventism is of a different stripe, I think. It's on the forefront of these things. They're the radical of the radicals for human rights, for religious rights. So this brief sketch of the pioneers offers us a warning and an inspiring reality to really try to strive for. And with that, we leave it there. And in our next conversation, if these guys are still around, if they're still willing, in our next conversation, we can pick up from 1859 and we can get into the disaster of the American Civil War and chart our way through what the Adventist movement, how the Adventist movement navigated through all that. So I want to thank you, all three of you, for joining me on this. And I want to really thank our viewers for joining us on this ride. And my apologies if we were nerding out too much on history, but that's what happens because these are Adventist historians here. That's what they do. They nerd out on history. Thank you so much for all your comments, and apologies for not being able to get to that because we're too distracted with having fun. We'll see you hopefully next week, and have